Zabona ba?
Hey, kunjani?
Phila wena.
All right, man. Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure that all goes well. Yeah, but so far so good.
All right. I'll just mute you so I can check if you are. Wait, have you started the meeting?
Yeah, because that was the thing that I was more worried about. So you want me to mute?
Okay, no, I'll mute myself so I can check if you are live on the platforms.
Okay, sure.
Sure.
All right.
All right, Baba, you're live.
Oh, okay. Lovely.
All
Lovely.
right. I'll mute myself and you're
Let's
good to
wait.
go.
All right,
I will.
let's wait for the prof to come in, make sure that everything is good.
Oh no, I'm checking you. I'm looking at you on your
Yeah.
Facebook live.
Okay. All right. No, then that's good. That's good. Thank you very much. What is that interference now? Hey, Prof. 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 Hi, Prof. Hey, Prof. Prof. Yeah, it's starting only at 4. Yes. Just wait. I'll send you the meeting ID and the password. All right, sure. Thanks, Prof.
Prof, can you hear me?
I can see Prof coming in.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Hey, Prof. You've unmuted yourself. You've muted yourself.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, Prof.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. But in terms of the sitting position, if you can go up, yeah. Don't you have like yeah, like just about that, so that we don't see a floating head, Prof.
Like this?
Yeah, like that, Prof. Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's very good.
Is this okay?
Yeah, that's okay, Prof.
Right. So, you know what? Nobody can hear us, eh?
They can now. So let's talk on the phone.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
Yeah, so we will follow the same format, informal format. And so you'll see I gave in my Facebook timeline. So I just want to, because we were out, we're doing pace. So we're not going to go straight into, I think we give the context and then we'll give the historical. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to go into Yeah, you prefer me to use a earpiece or should I just?
It's up to you, Prof. Whichever one is compatible.
will use it. You can hear me, yeah?
Yes, yes, very well.
Right.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen who have joined us via various social media channels. This is Dr. Fundile Nyati, and today we have an interesting guest who is no stranger to this platform. Today, our guest is Professor Mills Soko, who is the Professor of International Business and Strategy at the Wits Business School. Prof. Soko, welcome to the Dr. Fundi channel.
Good afternoon, Dr. Nyati. I'm very pleased to be back here again, and I look forward to an interesting and engaging conversation with you this afternoon. And good afternoon to all the viewers.
Yes, we definitely have an interesting one. You know, Prof, since Monday, you know, when one scans the newspapers, then social media, you know, platforms, there's been a lot of furor, you know, around the arrival of the medical, you know, contingent from Cuba. You know, now there's been opposing views around that. Some people feel, you know, we don't need them because South Africa still has a lot of unemployed doctors and retired doctors and other healthcare professionals. So why did they rush? Whilst on the other hand, other people are saying they are bringing in expertise that we do not have. They've got experience, you know, in dealing with pandemics, experience that we do not have. Now, so in the context of, you know, those opposing views out there, I thought, you know, it was important that I get somebody, you know, like you to actually help us with this discussion. And it was so nice to actually come across an article of yours that you wrote for the FIN 24, dated the 1st of May. And it was actually dealing with this matter of the Cuban contingent. Now, the first thing I want to know from you, Prof, what drove you to write that out?
What drove me was a concern that there was a great deal of public discussion that was not well informed. There were important concerns that were raised by the public with the way in which this matter was being handled by the government. And may I say, Dr. Nyati, that South Africans, you know, are familiar with the relationship between South Africa and Cuba. And they also appreciate the role that Cuba has played in the past in supporting the struggle against apartheid. And in particular, the courageous role that the Cuban forces played, you know, in the Battle of Quito Cuanavale in southern Angola, which led to a finding of a solution between the warring factions there that led to the independence of Namibia in 1990 and the withdrawal of the Cuban troops from Angola. So they're aware of that, but a context was never given, an explanation was never given as to why the Cuban doctors were coming to South Africa. What role were they going to play here in South Africa? At what cost? And what was the government going to do in relation to some of the concerns that have been raised about the Cuban doctors, who are very well qualified, very experienced, as you say, but you know, there are certain difficulties in terms of language differences, also the mismatch of skills. So I would have loved to see the government, Dr. Nyati, holding a press conference explaining all those issues. And this is what we are doing, and this is the reason we are doing it, and these are the benefits we will derive from it, and this is what it will cost us. and this is how we're going to, reconcile, our international commitments, our quest to bring the Cuban doctors here with our domestic concerns about the unemployment of doctors and a host of other domestic issues. So this is a big issue, but I think the government made a mistake of using its logic of politicians, logic of political activists, and make assumptions. And that is a dangerous thing to do. So that is what inspired me to write this article, to place things in perspective.
Now, there's something that I picked up in the article. You said the whole affair has been managed ineptly and created an impression that the South African government has been less than transparent or forthright about the trade-offs involved in the recruitment of the Cuban medical personnel. Can you just
when I talk about trade-offs, is that specific issue of what it costs to bring the Cuban doctors to South Africa, because a very unfortunate impression was given that this is it's a kind of a charitable act, gesture. It's altruistic. There are no commercial interests involved, and that is a misrepresentation. That is not true. Cuba is about international solidarity, of course, but it's also about commercial considerations, economic considerations, which have to do with addressing pressing domestic problems in Cuba. Economic problems brought about by largely economic sanctions imposed by successive American administrations. So there is a very delicate balance to strike there on the part of the Cubans. And I would have liked the South African government, Dr. Nyati, to explain that explicitly. There is nothing shameful about it. There is nothing unrevolutionary about it, right? That is how you conduct statecraft. There are trade-offs that have to be made, and those need to be explained. There are winners, there are losers, but those things need to be explained, and this did not happen. So there was this assumption that these are the Cubans, they fought against apartheid, and they must come here. And so it's a problematic way of doing things. In a democracy, the government has to account, it has to explain decisions, it's got to rationalize decisions, and this did not happen in this case. And this is why there was so much anger and so much confusion surrounding this. And it's very unfortunate that the Cuban embassy itself had to take the unprecedented step of issuing a public statement, which was also a convoluted statement, which was in itself, which really complicated what was already a complicated issue.
Because actually, when you talk about the Cuban statement, they basically continued on the idea, that altruistic idea that, they are here, they are not here for money, they are not here for luxury, they are actually here to actually help a friend. In essence, that's what I picked up from the statement. Do you think that statement was actually appropriate, though?
Historically, that is the case, Dr. Nyati, historically. And we need to understand why the relationship between the two countries is significant. It's because of the courage and the sacrifice that the Cubans made in support of our struggle against apartheid. And it's not just against apartheid. Cuba supported other liberation movements across the African continent.
Yes.
Cuba was active within the United Nations, within the non-aligned movement, in voicing its opposition and its condemnation of the apartheid system. So that must be acknowledged. And to send troops to Angola, some of whom died fighting valiantly against the apartheid regime, the South African Defense Force, that was a very courageous revolutionary act, and we need to acknowledge that. But we need to also acknowledge that the circumstances have changed. Cuba has many pressing domestic problems, largely which are economic, in the same way as we have domestic problems. So we are still committed, both countries are still committed to international solidarity, right? But at the same time, they have pressing domestic problems. So how do they reconcile their quest to pursue these international commitments with their desire to address domestic challenges and domestic problems? This is where the challenge is, and this is where frankness and transparency is important.
Yes. Now, Prof, there's something that was of interest as I was reading the article, where you basically said, if we look at the economy of Cuba, there are two key drivers. One being the export of medical personnel, which is the number one foreign currency, earner for the country, followed by tourism. All right. And during this time of COVID-19, obviously tourism, like all other countries, has been affected, which then means they need to try and increase, that revenue from their number one revenue earner, which is the medical, exports. Yeah, can you just talk about that, their economy and their policy? This policy of, exporting doctors, which started with Algeria in 1963.
That has to be understood within the historical context. Cuba was involved in a struggle. The progressive forces, the revolutionary forces, led by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and other revolutionaries, who led to the dethronement of the repressive regime then in 1958. So that is when the revolution was established. And so this Cuba is an island state. It's a vulnerable island in a very hostile environment, hostile setting, with a population of 11 million people. So it's heavily, and this is a policy which was defined by Fidel Castro when he became leader, that Cuba's global strategy will be informed by two considerations. One, a commitment to universal health care. That is number one. And that explains why the country is so well endowed in terms of medical expertise. That was a clear policy decision made by the Cuban government. And the second tenet of that policy was the whole policy of internationalism. That Cuba will be engaged internationally in supporting other liberation movements who want to free themselves from bondage, from oppression. So that explains the international activism of Cuba over the decades. Now, these are the two important sectors in the economy, two dominant sectors.
Yes.
Medical service exports, as you said, they constitute the largest share of the DGP, and also account for the largest share of the hard currency that this country generates. And the figure that is provided there in 2018, that amounted to just over $6 billion US.
Yes.
And the second largest earner of foreign exchange is tourism, which accounts for about $3 billion US. So that is half the total that is accounted for by medical service exports. So you can see how vulnerable the economy is. Number one, vulnerable to economic sanctions, especially the tourism sector. And this is how the Americans have conducted their policy towards Cuba, largely because the Americans are opposed to the system of communism, and secondly because they are opposed to Cuba's foreign policy, which has supported certain liberation movements across the world. So they have strangled the the Cuban economy over many, many years, to the point where it became near bankrupt. So that is one dimension of the economy's vulnerability. The second dimension is that of medical experts. So Cuba cannot afford not to strengthen its overseas medical program, because that is the linchpin of the economy. And it has been very clear about it, explicit about it. It's part of its official policy. And I wish this could be explained, and we'll talk about this later, in South Africa's public diplomacy, that this is Cuba's competitive advantage in the world, right? Cuba is a global medical power. It's a global medical power. So when you look at the figures, you'll see you are correct to say that this policy started in 1963 with the export of medical doctors to Algeria. And over the years, according to the Cuban government, over 400,000 public health care workers have been sent abroad to about to 164 countries. So that demonstrates the global footprint that Cuba has in terms of its medical expertise, and why it is called a global medical power. I'll just give you another statistic, Dr. Nyati. In 2019 alone, 2019, which is a few years ago, there were about 28,000 Cuban doctors across the world, right? 28,000. And name any other country that has that kind of footprint. So this is a very important competitive advantage, and Cuba should not be ashamed about it. And so we should be promoting that. And this explains, Dr. Nyati, why Cuba, has been hit, not to the extent of other countries. It has been hit by the coronavirus, but the coronavirus also has provided tremendous diplomatic opportunities. It has been a boon for the Cuban economy, because the Cubans have seen an opportunity to promote their reputation as a medical power, and to use this opportunity to make money, right, while they're helping friends and allies and other countries that invite them. They're providing this important service, but at the same time, they're making money to shore up their struggling economy. So the coronavirus outbreak, it has had terrible effects, but at the same time, it has provided opportunities for the island state of Cuba. And it has taken advantage of those. And it's very significant, Dr. Nyati, that for the first time, and this just shows how things are changing, the Italian government invited the Cubans to send doctors to Cuba. It's the first time in the history of this overseas medical program that Cuba has operated in a developed country. So that was very significant.
An EU country for that matter.
An EU country for that matter. And also that enabled Cuba to flex its diplomatic muscles, to engage in diplomatic power games, to drive a wedge between the U.S. The U.S. is, as you know, is opposed to this Cuban expansionism in the area of public health, but also the U.S. is had these difficulties with the EU. So the whole transatlantic relationship between the US and the EU has been tested by this act of diplomatic power play.
Yes. And I mean, like you just said, Prof, they've already sent their doctors to Wuhan, where this pandemic started. They've already sent doctors to Andorra. They've already sent doctors to Italy and South Africa right now. So they actually have more experience in dealing with this pandemic. And just about 4 years ago, they actually were at the forefront of dealing with the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And that's a much more even dangerous type of pandemic, because you get infected with Ebola, 9 out of 10 times you are going to die. But they go where no other people, are prepared to go. And so that is the experience I think that they are bringing to South Africa, the ability to confront and assist governments to deal with pandemics. And they did that successfully in West Africa. And so I think we should not be, apologetic, I think, in terms of bringing that kind of expertise. However, there are issues that you've mentioned, around transparency, clarity of why this transaction and what it entails. Now, you mentioned, in your article that increasingly Cuba has been reliant on the support from their foreign allies, to sustain its struggling economy. And you mentioned the issue of Venezuela. As I was preparing for this meeting, I picked up that almost a quarter of their exports are actually coming from Venezuela, and the very US government is actually against, their support of Maduro, who's actually, in Venezuela. But what about the old, friends like China and Russia? Why are they not coming to their rescue?
I think the important thing to understand here, Dr. Nyati, is that, and this is what I wish could be explained. Cuba is in a very invidious position, very difficult position. As I said, it's a small island which is faced with challenges from major powers. Just excuse me. It's faced with challenges from major powers. So it has the United States breathing over its neck. The US has been bent on destroying Cuba. The only time it enjoyed a respite was during the latter part, the late stages of the Obama administration, because President Obama wanted to normalize relations between Cuba and the United States, and he wanted to leave that as one of his lasting legacies. But as we know, that has been overturned by the Trump administration. So when President Trump came to office in 2016, one of the issues he set his sights on was the issue of Cuba, and to reverse the Obama legacy in Cuba. And to this end, the American administration has intensified the economic embargo against Cuba, around travel, around the shipment of oil, around the remittances and all that. So we have got to understand this, how vulnerable Cuba is. And it's in a very volatile area. So you mentioned Venezuela. Venezuela is the largest producer of oil in Latin America. It's a very important country, but which is extremely unstable, and which has been faced with internal conflict and a civil war and the standoff between the far-left government of President Nicolas Maduro and also the conservatives and the fascists, if I may use that word. So it's a conflict-ridden country, which is of strategic importance because of oil and other commodities that it produces. So it is a region that has attracted the major powers. So you have China is well established there. China has been supportive of Cuba, but also supportive of Venezuela. And again, that is not out of charity. Let me put it that way. China has self-interest also, right?
Yes.
It's not just about supporting. China is interested in oil, is interested. So it's there. And Russia also is there. Now, Russia, historically, before it became, it broke up after the end of the Cold War, when it was the Soviet Union.
Yes, USSR.
The Soviet Union was the main benefactor of Cuba. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the benefactor of Cuba. It looked after Cuba, provided subsidies, And when the Soviet Union broke up, that had a huge adverse implications for Cuba. It sent shock waves in Cuba, and that is how the decline of the Cuban economy started. But now we're seeing Russia returning. So it's a geopolitical game that is being played in that region. Russia is there. It's got its own interests, right? Some of which converge with those of China, with Cuba, but some of which diverge from those. We must always understand that. This is not about friendship, it's about interest, right?
Yes.
Some interests converge, some diverge, but they are there, all of them. Now, in this case, where the interests of Russia and China and Cuba converge is their support for the Maduro government and the opposition to the United States, right? So they want to act as a counter to the United States' quest to establish some kind of hegemony in Latin America. So it's a very big region with a lot of dynamics. You have Brazil, you have Colombia, you have Argentina. So it's a very, very difficult and complicated region. So the point I wanted to highlight is that we need to understand the vulnerability that Cuba faces and the challenges that it's a small island state, and why it is important to communicate so that we can understand what exactly this is all about.
So now their embassy, then, if you go back to that statement, which almost tries to say, you know what, we're just here to help. We're not interested in money. We're not interested in luxury. Yet we know that at least 2/3 of what is paid per doctor actually goes back to the government. So therefore, even the third that we pay is more than what they would normally be paid when they were in Cuba. But the 2/3 is actually going to the government coffers. So then why is the embassy not just accepting it as that? This is a business transaction.
There are two issues there, Dr. Nyati, one on which I think we are entitled to comment, yes, and another one which I think we are not entitled to comment on, which is an internal Cuban issue. The one we are entitled to comment on, in my view, is a statement that the Cuban embassy made, which gave the impression that this was purely altruistic, charitable act. Cuba is not interested in money, the doctors. So I think that one, and I said in my article, it's not a true reflection of what is happening. I use a stronger word, but I won't use it here. But so we can comment on that because you can't fool us. We know what's happening, right? Yes. And I think it's self-defeating of the Cuban government and the embassy, not to be upfront about it. But I think that statement was a defensive statement, right? It was a defensive statement to try and put out fires after some kind of public storm had erupted. Right? Yes. So we were entitled to comment on that, but I don't think we can comment, but I don't think it's part of the business of the South African government to dictate to how the Cuban medical program should be run. They've been running this program for decades, yes, right? And it's a successful program, and it's very clear that a lot of people or the doctors who participated from this program benefited. Some are paid more than what the Cuban doctors are paid back home. A lot of the doctors who participated in this, they've been able to make a lot of money in foreign currency, even though they are paid less, by global standards. But, by Cuban standards, they've been able to invest in houses and in other assets and so on. So it's very clear that it's been a successful program. Whether they are paid enough, that's another issue. Whether they're paid enough, it's an internal matter. But there are studies which have shown, and a colleague of mine from the University of Warwick, Stephanie, Batala, she did a series of studies, very detailed, interviews with the doctors, and she found that it is true that historically these doctors decided to participate in these foreign missions because of humanitarian conviction and revolutionary passion. That has always been the case. But and she says, since the 1980s, and especially in recent years, that is not it's not the only consideration. So the international solidarity, revolutionary socialism motivation is not the only factor now. There are other factors now.
Yeah.
And these are economic interests. They want money, and this program, it helps them. But also, some want to escape Cuba, to put it bluntly, right?
Yeah.
They want to leave Cuba because Cuba is not some kind of paradise. It's difficult. The economy, infrastructure is dilapidated, all those things. It's difficult, and largely, because of the external pressure that the country is facing. So some would like looking for greener pastures, and they've been forthright about that, right? So I think that we it's within our right as South Africans to say, look, this is not just about solidarity; it's also about commerce. But I don't think it's within our right that you guys you should pay your doctors this, right? And this is the basis of the American criticism.
Yes.
So Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the United States, issued a statement. I don't know if you read the statement, criticizing South Africa for using Cuban doctors. It is part of U.S. policy that South Africa should not use Cuban doctors, and if it does use Cuban doctors, it must pay them directly, not through the government, right?
But
so you have here.
That's also interference on our internal affairs.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying, for me, what is important is that acknowledgement that there is a commercial transaction taking place. South Africa and Cuba must not deny that. But whether we can prescribe to the Cubans how much they should pay, no, it's not within our right. It's up to the doctors themselves to demand. If they think that they're underpaid, they can demand more. In Cuba. But I also want to address that criticism because I think the United States, it's a policy that is characterized by double standards. They didn't say anything about Cuban doctors going to Italy, which was interesting.
Yes.
Right? And they did not say anything about Cuban doctors going to China. Now, they're going to South Africa. South Africa is a soft touch, So Mike Pompeo, who has been very quiet, by the way, is woken up from his slumber. And he decides to issue the statement, which is problematic, in my view. And one can argue that the United States has no right to dictate here, given the kinds of challenges that is facing currently, and where you have a country that is spending trillions of dollars on defense and has such a huge underclass, and that is faced with so many problems in the United States. But that's a discussion for another day.
But I did want us to touch a little bit there because why, Prof? Before the interview, I just did a head-to-head type of comparison on just some of the health indices between the US and Cuba. Just looking at the outcomes, things like what they call neonatal mortality rate, Actually, America is doing badly compared to Cuba when we look at that. When we look at the number of doctors per 1,000, people in a population, what Cuba is doing so well. And in fact, during the latter years of Obama, actually, they had already started accepting some of the medical people from Cuba, to come and assist them in some of their rural areas. So I think, for America to then tell us that, look, we shouldn't be making use of their skills, I think, like you said, it's double standards.
Yes, it's double standards. And, during, when the United States experienced Hurricane Katrina, I don't know if you remember Hurricane Katrina,
Yes, I
and that was
remember.
during the tenure of President George W. Bush.
Yes.
It was a very difficult situation for the United States, and the United States needed help. And they went as far as reaching out to the Cubans to assist, because the Cubans, it's not just about disease, it's about disaster relief. It's about they've done it in Brazil, they've done it in Venezuela, they've done it in Haiti. They've got the experience, right? And the United States, they reached out to the Cubans, but they did not take up the offer. Out of pride, eventually, they decided, no, they're going to do that. And the issue of human rights in Cuba was used as a pretext to refuse that offer. But that was after the Americans themselves had reached out to the Cubans.
Yes.
So I think that that's another issue, I think, Dr. Nyati, our government should be addressing. The Americans issued the statement, and there has been this veil of silence. What happened to our public diplomacy? Who is explaining what we are doing with respect to these issues? Nothing came out of that. But I want to address, I think, a really important issue, Dr. Nyati, which concerns a lot of people in South Africa.
I think let's
okay, we'll come to that.
Okay,
we'll come to that.
Say, let's focus now on South Africa. And everything that we think should have been done or must be done. But anyway, yes, go ahead, Prof.
Yeah. So, Dr. Nyati, South Africans need to understand why Cuba is important. Cuba is a strategic country globally. It's even more strategic to a country like South Africa. Apart from the role that they played in supporting us, our liberation struggle, and we reciprocated, and rightly so. When in 1991, former President Mandela, that was soon after his release, and he made a trip to Havana in the Cuban capital to meet with President Castro and to thank him and the Cuban people for the support, of our struggle. And then in 2009. South Africa honored President Castro. We bestowed upon him, the government bestowed upon him, the order of O.R. Tambo, the companion. So that was one of the highest orders, rightly so. But right now we need to change tack in terms of how we communicate this relationship. We need to emphasize the importance of historical solidarity. That is very important. Emphasize that and the role that Cuba has played, and also the values, historically that have around which the two countries have coalesced. In the past, their commitment to international solidarity. And all that. So that is one part. But I think the other part is the issue of commerce. So our relationship is not just about values, and it's also about commerce. It's about business. You in your blurb, you describe it as a business transaction, right? So it's about business. We are doing business with Cuba. Cuba is poor. Cuba is under immense pressure. Its economy it's under siege, it's near bankrupt, and Cuba wants to make money, and we are giving Cuba money. But we need to explain why we're giving Cuba money. Right? How much are we giving Cuba? And why are we giving Cuba that money? Right? Because remember, we also have domestic challenges. We have high unemployment, we have high inequality, we have poverty, and we have all these doctors in this case who are idling around. So how do we explain that? That needs to be explained. So we're bringing the Cubans because they have a history of doing this. And they go to areas where South Africans wouldn't go, the rural areas, and all. They went to Central and West Africa. Those three countries that were hit by Ebola. Ebola is a deadly disease, even deadlier than the coronavirus.
Yeah, if I had to choose between Corona and Ebola, I'll go for Corona anytime.
Yeah, so Ebola, and a lot of countries refuse to send their medical teams to West Africa to fight the Ebola virus. Cuba sent its medical personnel. They were in the forefront of fighting the Ebola virus. They were in the forefront in Haiti, in Brazil, everywhere. So, and they've done this since 1963. They've accumulated incredible experience, number one. Number two, when you look at the team that arrived here, because people are saying, oh, we have doctors here. Why should we? But you'll see that a large percentage of those of the personnel that arrived in South Africa, they have highly specialized skills. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I did.
Highly specialized skills. So, they're highly specialized, chosen specifically, for this purpose. So I would have loved the South African government to say, look, we have these skills, but we don't have enough of those. So we're bringing these people with the skills that we don't have and expertise that we don't have. And this is what they are going to do, right? Okay, so this is why they're here. This is how much we are paying them. And this is what they bring. They've fought Ebola, they have global experience, but in the South African context, this is what they're going to do. And then the other issue I would have loved the South Africans government to address is this whole issue about how do we then integrate the Cuban medical personnel into the South African context, because the issues, although we're allies, we're friends, but they don't know each other. They speak different languages. They come from different cultural contexts. So how are those issues addressed? I would have loved the South African government to address that and say, we are aware of this, and this is what we're doing to address those issues. Now, it's of great concern, Dr. Nyati, that, this thing is troubling me. I apologize. It's of great concern that South African Medical Association was not consulted. I don't know what your view is on that. To me,
well, there are historical issues, in South Africa. Now, we've been discussing the Cuba-China, the Cuba-South Africa relationship dating back to struggle days, Now, look, South African Medical Association is a voluntary association, all right? Now, if you go back to when they were still called MASA, Medical Association of South Africa, before they rebranded, the role they played, and the stances they took, during the times of, Biko, who were being killed and all of that, it wasn't very good. So as much as they are recognized and they are the biggest medical association in South Africa, however, I think issues of trust are not yet, at the levels, same way between private sector and public sector, there's still an element of mistrust. So I think that must have played a role in one way or the other. Because they came out guns blazing saying, you know what, we're not opposed to it, but we think you guys were a bit hasty, So I think issues of legitimacy, from those who are actually driving the healthcare system, but also the fact that they don't really represent all the doctors, but most of those who were privileged before are actually there. Yes, there's a number of black doctors now who belong to SAMA. However, one can't exactly say they are representative of the medical professions in the country. So they would rather talk to HPCSA, and they seem to have done that, so that they could get the fast tracking of the registrations and things like that. In any way, HPCSA is part of Department of Health. Yeah, so I think it's trust issues, Prof.
I understand. So I'm just looking at the profile, Dr. Nyati, of of the skills and expertise that these Cuban doctors bring. Just referring to my notes here, which what the government provided. So you would know better because you are a physician. So they are technology engineers, they are biostatistics, epidemiology experts, public health. So you can see this is a highly specialized expertise. It doesn't mean that we don't have those people in South Africa, but it might be that we don't have them in sufficient numbers. So there might be.
And another issue, Prof, there, without wasting your time, is that the whole orientation of their medical training or approach to healthcare is actually very different to ours, in the sense that when you look at healthcare interventions, you've got what we call proactive healthcare interventions, that is, health promotion, disease prevention. And then you've got reactive interventions, which is treatment, rehabilitation. Now, our healthcare system in South Africa relies a lot on curative medicine, the reactive side of healthcare, whilst theirs is rooted on primary healthcare, which is about health education, awareness creation, health promotion, behavioral change, risk, reduction, and early detection. So they're actually more suited to dealing with a problem where there is no treatment,
Yes.
like the COVID-19.
Yes. That's helpful. The big issue in foreign policy, Dr. Nyati, foreign policy is very difficult to conduct because foreign policy must reflect domestic concerns. So you don't just conduct foreign policy for its own sake. You conduct foreign policy to pursue domestic interests. And our relationship with Cuba must primarily help us to achieve our domestic goals. And that is not about Cuba. It's not only about Cuba, but it's about all our international, partners, peers, other countries. So foreign policy must work towards enabling us to achieve domestic interests. So the question we should be asking in this context is the presence of Cuban doctors helping us to achieve our domestic interests? I would say yes, it does, right?
Yes.
It does in principle, but we need to give it flesh. We need to give it substance. So we need to say it's good to have Cuban doctors here, but in order to ensure that we as a country derive substantial benefit and substantive benefit from their presence, this is how we want to maximize their presence. So we want them, they are bringing these skills, we want them to work with the locals here, and we're not ignoring the locals. And we've explained to you how much we are paying them, and how does that compare with all those things with the fees that we pay out, so that we have all the information. So transparency and frankness, as I say, that should be the touchstone of our foreign policy. That should be the touchstone. So I believe that it's important for us, to clarify these things. And I do believe that it's positive and beneficial for the Cubans to be here. But we've got to, the government needs to sell that position. It needs to convince us. It needs to make it credible. And this is where the role of public diplomacy comes into play, right?
Yes.
There's something called public diplomacy, and how the government communicates. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the point you just made before, Prof, that, I'm in business consulting,
Yes.
I mean, our clients are employers. And whenever we engage, we are engaged, to assist an employer, as part of the, contract, there are clear, deliverables, including what we call skills transfer, over a period of time. When the contract comes to an end, you must have demonstrated this type of skills transfer. And I would say, in the kind of contract that clearly there's a contract between our government and Cuba. And for the 12 months that they're going to be here, there must be clear deliverables, not only in terms of dealing with the cases that we're saying, but also in terms of transferring skills to some of our experts who don't have as much international experience, so that at the end of the day, you can weigh the 440 million on one side to the broader value add, including the saving of lives.
Yeah, and this is about, remember this relationship and the contract that has been concluded is not between, is between the Cuban government and the South African government.
Agreed.
Right? It is not between the Communist Party of Cuba and the ANC. Right? It's between governments. So public accountability is important. So the ANC government cannot assume that everybody knows about this. Everybody accepts. This is taxpayers' money. So there has to be accountability. I don't know about the Cuban government. You know, the system is different there. But here, we're a democracy, so that democratic accountability is important. And so the way this whole issue has been handled, it has been handled as though it was a matter between governing parties, and we have no reason to explain things. I understand there might have been a lot of pressure because they're operating under pressure. We need these people here and so on, but that does not justify, in my view, explaining things. And to go back to the whole architecture of communication.
Yes.
There was a time, Dr. Nyati, there was a time when, I used to be in awe of the way in which our government communicated, in particular during the years. I don't know if you remember James Maseko.
Yes.
When he was in charge of communications, I remember that period vividly, and I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Before the Gupta's unseated.
Yes. So I enjoyed it during the Mbeki era, and also for some time during the Zuma era when he was in charge of government communications. I appreciate that because a lot of information that was in the interest of the public was made available to the public, right? Proactively. And I don't know what happened to that. I don't know why we have sort of regressed in respect of that. And I think one of the lessons about this whole affair, about this whole episode, is that we need to rejig our communications infrastructure and public diplomacy. DECO needs to be proactive. It needs to communicate. That you can never over communicate. You can never over communicate, right? Keep communicating, explain things. We live in a complicated world, in a very, very multi-layered world, and it's going to get complicated more and more. And we are going to have to overhaul our foreign policy because of the impact of the coronavirus. One of the things we're going to have to do is to overhaul our foreign policy. That's going to need a lot of explaining. So we need the communications infrastructure to communicate positions like these, explain things, clarify. Mike Pompeo issued a statement. I would have expected within an hour, right, a rejoinder from DECO and say, Secretary Pompeo, we regret that and clarify our position.
Yeah.
So these things are left hanging in the air, and so that is unacceptable. Yes. That is unacceptable.
Yes. Yeah. And Prof, I disturbed you. You were following a certain line of thinking around the public, whatever. Yeah. So I want you to continue. Around what could be done better. Yes, they've now not communicated well, but it's never too late. What are the things that I think our government, both at presidency level, at DECO level, and also Department of Health level, what are the things that they could do better?
So I think for me, the public diplomacy lesson number one, it's about consultation. So this affair shows us that there was no consultation. You have contextualized it, right? So we understand why the medical association there could be reasons why they were not, but that doesn't justify. So consultation, number one. Number two, there should be an explanation of why the Cubans are coming and how much it would cost for them to to be here.
Yes.
So the lesson then, don't make assumptions. You can never over communicate, explain why they're here. And then number three, I think, before I go to number three, the issue of what benefits do they bring? What skills,
Yes.
what expertise? Is this the kind of expertise that is available in South Africa? And if not, they're bringing it, or it might be available, but we don't have sufficient expertise. So they are here to bridge that expertise, to augment it,
Yes.
right? So those things must be explained. And I think, to go back again, we can never over-explain the importance of striking the balance between international commitments and
Yes.
domestic pressures. So we are going to have to explain this. That is how you explain foreign policy. Because South Africans will always say South Africa first.
Yes.
Rightly so. Rightly so. Right? So why are you giving aid money to this country, to this poor country, when we are poor too?
Yes.
Those are the questions. These are justifiable questions. And they can be answered, because countries, it's not so simple. It's about balancing international commitments with domestic concerns. We are internationally integrated. We cannot remove ourselves from the world. So we have to pay subscription fees to the United Nations. We have to pay money, to international organizations that we belong to, because we made a decision to belong to those organizations, right? So we know that money could have gone towards building a toilet somewhere but there are trade-offs that we're making, right? But they need to be explained, and why and how they benefit the country. So how do we reconcile our international concerns with our domestic pressures? That is very, very important to me. And then I think the other issue, Dr. Nyati, which I wanted to highlight, is that this is an interesting case study, the Cuban affair, from which we can learn, because there will be many other issues like this that test us, and we should use this as an example. I believe very strongly that this is an important relationship. In my view, it's a strategic relationship, and it's got a huge significance and a symbolism, given our struggle against, the history of our struggle against apartheid. So it needs to be strengthened, this relationship, but it needs to be conducted in a different way. There needs to be more transparency. There needs to be more honesty in the relationship. And there needs to be more mutual criticism. Yes. Right? Because, these are not angels. South Africa, we are not angels. The Cubans are not angels. There are issues that we know about that are happening in Cuba concerning human rights abuses, and also. So it's a relationship that needs to be conducted within that spirit. We are allies. We remain friends, but we should do so transparently, and do so frankly.
Yes. Now, on Tuesday, I actually conducted an interview with the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Health, Dr. Sibongiseni Dlomo. And it was actually around this issue, NHI, and how we are handling the pandemic. Now, listening to you and, pointing out where things could have been done better, what do you think that Portfolio Committee, in Parliament, the oversight responsibilities by that Portfolio Committee in Parliament, what do you think they should have done in holding, the executive to account?
Okay, two things. One, I'm an academic, firstly, so I have the license. Yes. Right? I have the license. Like artists. Yeah, so I have the license. I can speak frankly, and I can level criticisms in a fair but critical way, right? So I can speak up my mind. I'm an academic, and that matters to me. but I do so in a very balanced and fair way, and factual. It's based on facts. My criticisms should be based on facts, right?
Yes. Constructive.
Now, we have 3 branches of government. So we have the legislature, we have the executive, we have the judiciary, and the chairperson of the portfolio committee spoke to leads a very important portfolio committee in Parliament. And Parliament is there to represent the people and to hold the executive accountable, right? So I would have expected him to ask searching questions, to establish, how this decision was reached and why was it not communicated and all those issues, how much it cost, and where will the money come from, and all those. These are questions Parliament is enjoined to ask. I don't know if I didn't see your interview. I don't know if that's what it did.
I only put it up yesterday because we needed to work on it. There were some challenges with connection, so certain parts needed to be cut out. Yeah. Okay,
but I would have expected those questions to be asked because that is the responsibility of Parliament. That is the mandate of Parliament to hold the executive accountable, right? I don't know if that's what it did, but a more important issue, Dr. Nyati, is that we know that our legislature, in 1994, we had one of the most active parliaments, an activist parliament. An activist parliament, which was fearless, which was meticulous, which was portfolio committees were run by the extremely talented people. I remember them, I was in parliament myself. Raymond Satna, not as an MP, but as an official. So I saw this, Saki Makozoma, Blade Zimani when he chaired. So they were very informed, activist members of Parliament led by extremely dynamic chairpersons of committees. But we know it became eroded over the years. It became eroded, and especially during the era of President Zuma, I don't have to elaborate on that. We saw what was happening in Parliament. So I think this is where the challenge is, to try and re-establish the primacy of Parliament in our democracy. And I would have expected the chairperson of that portfolio committee, to represent you and me, not the executive. They're there to represent you and me, right? Yeah. So the questions we ask, the searching questions, the probing questions that we ask, would expect them to articulate, to voice those concerns and questions. So I will watch the interview, and I will tell you privately. I will send you a WhatsApp message to tell you what I thought about it.
Yes, but as we wrap up, Prof, what other aspects would you want to just talk about relating to the topic, more around constructive stuff now? I don't think it's too late for them to do certain things, and yes, lessons need to be learned so that we can do better. So what other take home messages?
Dr. Nyati, the important thing about this is that which we need to stress is, the government, the president, President Ramaphosa, the cabinet, the government, the state bureaucracy, the various social actors, business, religious. We've done extremely well in terms of handling the coronavirus crisis.
Yes.
That is a matter of public record, which is widely acknowledged even internationally. So we've done very well. The government has done well. This is uncharted territory for any government, right? Yes. No government has faced this before. And there are so many considerations and pressures that have to be juggled around. And we don't have, there is the luxury of time and all. So that we understand that, the government has done very well. We should not take that away from it. But it doesn't mean we should not criticize certain aspects where criticism is justified. You know,
Yes.
we can criticize, but criticize constructively and fairly, and offer suggestions, recommendations, you know, solutions. So by focusing on this issue, so when I decided to write this article, I wanted to highlight a shortcoming with respect to how the government conducts statecraft. There's something called statecraft, the way you conduct the affairs of state, right?
Yes.
So I wanted to highlight that, you know, that there is a shortcoming here, the way we dealt with this issue, and there are lessons to be learned from it. And in future, when we're faced with this kind of challenge, you know, this is what we could do. So that was the purpose of this, but it's not intended to nullify the important, the good work that has been done. You know, I previously wrote another article. I don't know if you read it. You know, before this one, I wrote an op-ed, which was highlighted the impressive manner in which you know, the leadership, South African leadership had handled. You know, this crisis within the first 3 weeks. You know, things might change, but the first 3 weeks, you know, they handled very well. And
I remember the article. You even praised the leadership qualities of our president that you know, have come up. Yeah, I remember the article. Yes. Yeah.
So it's carrots. You know, it's sticks. It's carrots. It's skin. That's how it is, right?
Yes. Now, one last you know, question from me, Prof. You know, relating to the criticism that we had not optimized our internal resources. Now, as I was preparing for the interview for the chairperson last week on Tuesday, I came across information that actually at the beginning of April, I think it's the 4th of April or 8th of April, I'm not sure exactly, there was a government gazette that came out asking South Africans who are qualified healthcare professionals to actually show interest in terms of saying, I'm available. I was in private practice, but my practice is not doing well. You know, I can actually lend a hand, you know, for a fee. You know, or I'm unemployed. They said there's no budgets, you know, posts are frozen, but I'm available. So now my issue then is that when we then say we did not look at internal resources, what is the responsibility of the South African healthcare workers to actually raise up their hand when their country needs them?
You know, Dr. Agwati, I'm not sure if I'm qualified to answer that.
No. I was just mentioning that.
Yes, yeah. It's a rhetorical question. It's a rhetorical question, and I think that you are well positioned in this respect because you are a physician, a very experienced physician who's an entrepreneur also. You understand the internal dynamics within the medical profession. So in the same way as the engineering profession or the accounting profession or the auditing profession needs to get its act together, I think, you've been familiar with the internal issues, perhaps. I don't know if you know the chairperson of the Medical Association and all. These are the kinds of issues that you bring to their attention, you know, as part of improving how they operate.
Yes. No, but anyway, Prof, we are out of time, but we could talk, you know, for the whole day, me and you, around this matter.
Yes.
But I want to thank you, Prof. You know, I really enjoyed the article. You know, that's why I invited you here. I enjoyed our previous interview. You know, it gave me, you know, a better understanding of the dynamics of the continent. And this one, you've done exactly the same. In fact, you've exceeded my expectations. So I hope also our viewers have actually enjoyed, because really for me, it's not just about pointing holes, you know, and not coming up with, you know, constructive solutions to issues, but it's also about educating. Maybe because my parents were both teachers. So there's a part about me that is about educating, empowering, you know, sharing information. And you have done that. You have educated us about the relationship between South Africa and Cuba. You've gone deeper into understanding the economics, or the state of economy of that country, the drivers, the challenges that they have, but also, being forthright about the fact that this is a business transaction amongst friends. And there's nothing wrong with doing business with friends, as long as things are transparent. And I think on the latter part of the interview, where we're talking about things that could have been done better, I hope, as this video circulates and it reaches some of the decision makers, they will look at this positively, that, Prof was trying to, come up with a balanced, a view that is not intended to nullify the good work that has been done, but actually to say there was room for improvement, there is room for improvement, and because we're a democratic country, there are a few things that should be done and done better. So I want to thank you, Prof, for your time. I know it was quite difficult. I only asked you yesterday. You've got so many other commitments, but I thank you. Really, this was a very good interview, and it was very, informative, and thank you for that.
Dr. Nyati, thank you again. I really appreciated you extending an invitation to me again to be on this channel, and I want to reiterate my praise for you, for the tremendous work that you are doing in terms of facilitating public discourse around this series of topics, very important, very pertinent topics. I've been following with a great interest what you're doing, and I would like to continue to encourage you to do this. And I hope that the viewers on audio platforms found my contribution useful and enlightening this afternoon, and I look forward to participating. Again, provided you invite me, and provided I have something useful to say. I have something useful to say.
I can't wait for the lockdown, to eventually come to an end. Obviously, when we have flattened the curve, to just have a round table, a real round table. Call in, Dr. Josi from HVCSA, call in somebody like you, call in Dr. Lomo, and we talk about these things. Because I think it is important that we engage each other, and out of that, many heads are always better than one. So I want to thank you, Prof. And
thank you so much. Have a good evening.
All right.
Of course.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much, and thank you to our viewers.
Sharp.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
All right.